I have repaired this RX 580 by basically doing nothing. So let's see how it plays games in 2023. If you didn't know, this is the RX 580 from one of my previous videos, and in that video it wasn't working properly. I thought this was down to faulty video memory, but it turns out I was wrong, which is actually a good sign because this graphics card now is working totally fine. And in this video it was blue screening and causing artifacts and crashing, so what I did was I lowered the core and the memory clocks, and this made it somewhat stable. However, I have applied a fix though, and all that fix was just raising the power limit to plus 30%, and now it works totally fine. I've also flashed the VBIOS on it as well. I'm not sure if that's made a difference because this is a ex-mining card, and sometimes miners do put a custom VBIOS on there, which does limit the voltage, which is actually a good thing because it makes sure that the graphics card doesn't get too worn out. But with both these fixes that I've applied to it, it runs totally fine in games now, giving no blue screens, no crashes, no artifacts, and I could even get away with applying a bit of an overclock to the memory as well with no issues. So I'm getting more performance now and stability, which is always great, isn't it? So it wasn't down to bad VRAM or down to bad thermal pads for the memory. It just turns out the GPU core was being starved of power. Maybe the GPU core is slightly worn out on this thing, I'm not too sure, or it could have been the VBIOS as I've said, but it's working fine now, so yeah, what's not to like, eh? AMD's RX 580 launched in the spring of 2017. There were two SKUs available, one being 4GB and the other one being 8GB. But they had the same GPU core with 2304 shading units and a 256-bit memory bus. And the RX 580 was on many budget gamers' radars, as the 8GB version only cost $229 US at launch, and the 4GB one, which is this one, would have cost even less. I think it was around $190 US from what I can remember, maybe even a bit less. Couple this with the fact that not many games in 2017 needed 8GB of memory. Budget gamers back then were kind of spoiled between this and the GTX 1060. But in 2023, the 8GB version is stealing all of the thunder, and probably rightfully so, as in this day and age, 8GB of VRAM is kind of the minimum for modern AAA games. I am trying to source a 8GB version, so if you want to see that, make sure you stay subscribed. But back to the 4GB version now, and I wanted to see how this got on in 2023 now that I've got this fixed. I've tested at 1080p with no upscaling methods like FSR 2.1, so it is just standard raw 1080p gaming performance. All testing has been done on my test bench, which has a Ryzen 5 5600G, 32GB of CL16, 3200MHz dual rank dual channel DDR4 memory, a 1TB Sabrent NVMe Gen 3 SSD, and an Asus Strix B550-F. I have overclocked the memory on this thing to 1900MHz, which should give a bit of a gaming performance boost. However, most RX 580s, and even RX 570s for that matter, will be able to reach 1900MHz on the memory just fine. Core clocks on the GPU core have been left totally stock at 1366 though. So with that being said, let's get into the benchmarks. First game up today is actually a new one, and that is F123. It does actually look quite a bit better than its predecessor, F122, which was a terrible game. But back to the RX 580's performance here, and at the medium preset, in the Wet Australian Grand Prix benchmark, it scored 86 FPS on average with a 1% low of 72. This is excellent performance from this 6-year-old graphics card, and I don't see any issues here at all. 86 FPS is not technically the smoothest frame rate, especially if you've got a 144Hz monitor, so if that's you, I'd recommend putting it down to low. The game wouldn't look too good, but the extra smoothness in the frame rate would probably benefit you quite a bit in this title. So yeah, F123, totally playable. Fortnite is up next, and unlike last time, I tested it with DirectX 12, which is what I usually do with slightly higher end graphics cards. However, on DirectX 12, performance is great, with 136 FPS on average with a 1% low of 96. This is the good thing about DirectX 12 with Fortnite that I've noticed. The 1% lows are much better than the performance API, so 136 FPS on average is certainly not bad. I'd probably recommend using DirectX 12, but if you really want more performance, the performance API might be a good choice for you. Either way though, Fortnite yet again, very playable on this RX 580. Next up is kind of in the opposite direction, and that is Horizon Zero Dawn. Setting it to the original preset did actually give us some issues with this 4GB card, as textures were just struggling to load and they looked horribly muddy. However, despite these issues, the 4GB RX 580 got 66 FPS on average with 51 FPS for the 1% low. So is this playable in terms of frame rate? Certainly. I'd probably lower the texture quality though, just to make sure you're not running out of VRAM. This would not be an issue on the 8GB version, and you'd probably get slightly more performance on that as well. So Horizon Zero Dawn with a 4GB RX 580, not something I recommend. Next up is Cyberpunk, and this is probably another disappointing game because here I just set it to low with the high textures. I somehow managed to get away with high textures. I don't quite know how, but yeah, this resulted in 49 FPS for the average and 36 FPS for the 1% low. So there weren't that many stutters in this benchmark, but the frame rate just isn't really high enough. If you really want to play Cyberpunk on this graphics card, I'd probably recommend enabling FSR, because even on the lower presets, Cyberpunk still looks pretty good, to be honest. Apart from the reflections, they look trash. But is it playable on this graphics card? Yes, but if you really want to play Cyberpunk, I'd recommend an Nvidia graphics card. Next up is Rainbow Six Siege, and this is proper RX 580 4GB territory because this is just a incredibly easy to run esports game. Here I set it to the high preset, which you'd probably not want to do if you want to play this game professionally. You'd probably set it to low. However, even on this preset, the RX 580 got 185 FPS on average with a 1% low of 142. This is incredible performance, it's nice and smooth, there's no stutters at all in the benchmark, so yeah, if you've got a 144Hz panel, these settings are perfectly fine. If you've got a 240Hz, maybe drop these to maybe medium or low and you'll be having a great gaming experience there. GTA 5 is up next, and basically on all of these graphics cards I test it pretty much maxed out apart from the advanced settings. So here I set it to very high with 2x MSAA. This clears up the jagged lines quite a bit and it's much better than FXAA, but it does tax the hardware quite a bit. But that's fine though, because the RX 580 got 71 FPS on average with a 1% low of 59 FPS. For a game like GTA 5, you should be aiming for around 60 FPS, so anything over that's a bonus in my opinion, and 71, I'd take that on a graphics card that cost me 35 quid, so yeah, perfectly fine here. The Witcher 3 used to be pretty demanding back in the day, but at the end of last year it received a graphics overhaul which made it much harder to run in 2023, so yeah, it does look good, but it does perform, it leaves a little to be desired, put it that way. However, on the medium preset with DirectX 11 selected as the API, which does work better with older graphics cards like these, I've noticed, 66 FPS for the average and 57 FPS for the 1% low is not bad performance for a graphics card like this. This game is certainly playable, and as I said with GTA 5, anything over 60 is a bonus in a game like this. So yeah, if you want to play The Witcher 3 on your RX 580 4GB, the medium preset is definitely the one to go for. Last game up today is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. It's still quite popular and yeah, it's always worth benchmarking. Setting it to the minimum preset with normal textures, we couldn't quite get away with high with 4GB of video memory. This is something where the 8GB version would be totally fine. However, it looks better than the lowest muddy textures, so it doesn't look too bad. Performance isn't too bad either, with 74 FPS on average with 58 FPS for the 1% low. It does leave a little more to be desired though, so I'd probably recommend enabling FSR 2.1 and putting that into quality just to get a bit more frames in this game, but other than that, performance is not too bad at all. So most games tested today actually performed relatively well, and I don't really have any complaints, especially the esports games like Fortnite, Rainbow Six Siege, even older games like GTA 5 performed totally fine with no issues, but this was to be expected with a GPU of this caliber. Even newer games like Modern Warfare 2, the performance was nothing to complain about at all. Maybe in this game I'd probably recommend enabling FSR 2.1 and putting that onto quality just to get a bit more frame rate, because in these games frame rate does matter quite a lot. But other than that though, I don't really see an issue with the performance in Modern Warfare 2 either. On the other side of the coin is Cyberpunk, which kind of performed poorly, not even reaching 50 FPS on average. Cyberpunk is a bit of an Nvidia hunting ground, so this was kind of to be expected, but not even getting 60 FPS on the lowest preset with native 1080p rendering is not exactly impressive, is it? There was also Horizon Zero Dawn, which just totally ran out of VRAM and all the textures just look muddy. This wouldn't be an issue on the 8GB version of this card, so yeah, that's a downfall of the 4GB version of the RX 580. I know not all of these games are the newest AAA releases, but I think they are pretty realistic to what someone would play if they had an RX 580 4GB. Also, I do need to get around to updating my test benching roster at some point this year. I know I will get round to it, just give me some time. So the main issue, which I've alluded to in this video already, is the 4GB of VRAM on this RX 580. It's simply not enough for modern AAA gaming. Look at Horizon Zero Dawn, for instance. That game just totally ran out of VRAM and all the textures just looked horribly muddy, even on the original preset, which is essentially medium. This is not ideal because this would not be an issue on the 8GB version, as the textures would just look totally fine on that, and you could probably even get away with high or maybe even ultra textures on there. And this is why I'd recommend using the highest texture quality that you can with your current frame buffer. So as long as you don't exceed your frame buffer with your texture quality, you will hardly lose any performance, nothing noticeable at least. Because I think, and many other gamers for that matter, textures are the biggest contributing factor to the game's sort of graphical fidelity, if that makes sense. But with that being said, if you just want a cheap esports gaming graphics card and you want to play games like Rainbow Six Siege, Rocket League, Minecraft, even Fortnite, the 4GB version is totally fine here, as these are not the most demanding games in the world, and you're going to be running these at low settings anyway, so VRAM's not really a problem here. So my final thoughts on the RX 580 4GB version are kind of mixed. For the latest and kind of greatest, they're not really that great in the AAA games, to be honest. The RX 580 4GB does not have enough VRAM, and that is just simple. You'd probably get away with the lowest texture settings, but who wants to do that? However, if you want to play esports games or indie titles, the RX 580 4GB has enough VRAM for these, and that is the perfect thing about PC gaming, because you can pick up a graphics card like this for around 40 quid and you'll still get a high refresh rate experience in these games. So pair this with a cheap 144Hz monitor and you've got a seriously good budget gaming PC on your hands right there. So do I recommend this graphics card to most people? No, but if you're just getting into esports for the first time, maybe the 4GB version might be for you, because it is quite a bit cheaper than the 8GB version, because they're not as sought after. So with that being said, I'm going to leave this video here. If you like this one, leave it a like, stay subscribed for more tech content, and I'll catch you in the next one.